Good evening. Elvis Presley died today. He was 42. The reports came fast and cold, the way headlines do when the world is about to change. A heart attack, they said. Found at home in Memphis, not breathing. His road manager tried to bring him back and couldn't. The hospital tried and couldn't. His doctor pronounced him gone at 3 o'clock this afternoon. And just like that, the curtain fell early on one of the most spectacular careers American entertainment ever carried on its shoulders. But even then, even in that final sentence, something didn't sit still. Because some names don't settle into silence. Some lives don't know how to end. For nearly 5 decades, Elvis Presley's tomb at Graceland stood like a locked door no one dared to touch, untouched, sealed, wrapped in ceremony and mystery, guarded not only by stone, but by the weight of what he meant to people. Yet time has a way of loosening even the tightest seals, and now, under official clearance, under global eyes, it was opened. And what they found wasn't only the evidence of a life that ended. It was personal, emotional, confounding, cluster of artifacts that felt less like burial and more like a message tucked into history, letters, objects, reminders that this wasn't only a legend in rhinestones and spotlight. This was a man, and the discovery didn't close the story. It cracked it open, because the first question wasn't what was inside. The first question was the one that had haunted fans from the beginning. Was the body really his? Or had the king of rock and roll pulled the greatest disappearing act in history? Experts weighed in. Fans broke down. And suddenly, Elvis Presley was no longer a name that belonged only to the past. His story somehow was breathing again. The truth began to rise, but so did deeper questions, because some legends don't rest the way ordinary people do. They echo, they linger. They wait beneath the marble, beneath the music, beneath the myth. For nearly 50 years, Graceland was more than a mansion. It became sanctuary, a shrine, a place people traveled to not just for the gates, the gold records, the polished rooms, but for that quiet center of it all, the resting place everyone believed held Elvis himself. Memphis, Tennessee became a kind of compass point, drawing people from everywhere, pulling them toward the same thought. He was here. He's really here, but what if he wasn't? Ever since the funeral in 1977, the question swirled like smoke that refused to clear. Some believed the body never made it into the crypt at all. Others believed something precious was buried with him, something hidden on purpose, something never meant for the world's hands. Decades passed and whispers didn't fade. They multiplied. They turned into books, documentaries, arguments, candlelit conversations at the gates. Because grief doesn't always stay quiet, sometimes it becomes curiosity. And curiosity becomes belief. One devoted visitor once put it into words that carried the whole strange heartbeat of Graceland. You don't come there only to remember Elvis. You come hoping he'll reach back. So when news broke that officials had legal permission to open the tomb, the world didn't just watch. It listened. The stated reasons sounded practical preservation, structural review. But beneath that official language was something else entirely. A moment fans had imagined for half a century. A moment believers had waited for. The moment that would either settle the question forever or rip it wider. Crowds gathered outside Graceland, not loud, not wild, almost reverent. Some stood in silence. Some sang softly like a prayer, love me tender, floating into the air like a memory refusing to fall. And everyone felt it. This was not routine maintenance. This was history being disturbed, a sealed mystery with a heartbeat. The gates opened not only for workers, but for a story that had never learned how to end. And as the sealed crypt was approached, cameras rolling, guards close by, the world leaned forward. But before the tomb could be opened, the real reason it mattered had to be faced. not the marble, not the vault. The rumor that never died. What if Elvis never died at all? The whispers began the moment the world was told he was gone. The official story was written in clean lines: heart attack, sudden loss, tragedy. But behind it, a shadow formed almost immediately, one theory that clung to the edges of every headline and refused to let go. That Elvis Presley didn't pass away the way they said he did. That he staged an exit, vanished, slipped into another life, hidden from the spotlight. Beyond the reach of the world that demanded him. It sounds like the plot of a film. The kind you'd watch and shake your head at. But for many, it felt less like fiction and more like possibility. Because Elvis wasn't just famous, he was consumed by fame. And people who are consumed sometimes dream of escape. The theory spread quickly, that by small details that felt too strange to ignore. The name on the gravestone didn't match exactly what some expected. A tiny difference, one letter yet to conspiracy minds, that was enough to become a sign. A deliberate mark. A clue left behind like a wink from the shadows. And then the sightings came. Elvis in a diner. Elvis at an airport. Elvis buying books on numerology, quiet as a stranger. Hidden in plain sight. At first, they sounded like the usual noise people wanting to believe, wanting to see. But the stories piled up until they felt like a pattern. Like a myth that was building itself. And the more people dug, the stranger it got. The funeral casket was said to be heavy. Too heavy, some insisted, for a single body. Rumors formed around that wait wild ones, talk of decoys, talk of wax. Talk of cold air systems meant to preserve an illusion long enough for the world to accept it. And there were the tales about security cameras at Graceland going dark right before he was found unresponsive. A detail like that doesn't prove anything, but it doesn't fade either. It becomes fuel. All of it fed one enduring idea. The king didn't die. He walked away. The rumors lived in paperback spines, television specials, late night radio, then eventually across the internet like sparks that never stopped catching. Some said witness protection, some said debts, some said threats. The details shifted, but the belief stayed solid. A man named Elvis Presley died. Yes, but maybe the real Elvis went somewhere else. Now. With the tomb finally open, the question sharpened into something almost unbearable. Would this end the debate? Or would it ignite something bigger than ever before? Outside Graceland, people held their breath. Reporters stood ready. The marble had been silent for 50 years. But silence doesn't mean empty. And when the moment came, it didn't arrive gently. It arrived like thunder behind a closed door, because even when truth steps forward after decades of quiet, it doesn't always bring peace, music. The unsealing happened on a clear morning, the kind of day people might have once called bright, blue, and impossible to forget. Security was tight, officials were present, preservation experts watched with careful eyes. Family-appointed lawyers stood close, not to dramatize the moment, but to control it. And the air itself felt strange, like it was holding something back. News vans lined the street. Helicopters hovered. Fans gathered outside the gates, some crying, some gripping flowers, some holding handmade signs that said what their hearts couldn't stop repeating. We still believed. It felt like two events happening at once: a funeral and something almost like a resurrection. When the marble slab was lifted with slow precision, the world seemed to stop moving. This was it. The moment so many had imagined in whispers, in theories, in restless nights. Was the king still there? Inside was a preserved burial vault, the kind meant to keep time out and dignity in. Forensics experts were there, not simply to document, but to confirm. To settle what could be settled. And yes, there were remains, but the presence of a body wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a deeper one, because alongside what you'd expect, there were personal items, artifacts that felt like private life placed carefully into the dark, letters, photos, pieces of memory, jewelry, items believed lost or never meant to be seen again. And then an envelope, a letter that would soon ripple through headlines around the world. The discoveries were respectful, even reverent, but they were also startling. Some things hinted at struggle, some carried tenderness. Some looked like words meant for Priscilla, and others like quiet thoughts left for Lisa Marie. And while the world was busy staring at the story, one question remained steady and sharp beneath everything else. Did the evidence match? Elvis Presley, the man seen in every photograph, heard in every song, felt in every era. The experts didn't rush answers. The vault was open, and the truth, whatever it was finally exposed to daylight. But even daylight can cast long shadows, because what they found in that tomb didn't belong only to a performer. It belonged to a man, to a father, to a family who had been living with an unfinished ache for decades. Comment 42 or right. Rip Elvis Presley to honor them. Priscilla's name carried a different kind of silence through all of it, the kind that lingers after love becomes history. In the storm of attention, in the noise of theories and cameras, her presence felt like a softer gravity, pulling everything back toward what mattered. Because behind the icon, behind the gold and the mythology, there were relationships, rooms with closed doors, words that never reached microphones. And as details surfaced of letters addressed to her, words that seemed meant for private air, rather than public screens, the world remembered again that fame doesn't replace intimacy. It only complicates it. Some items inside that vault looked like they belonged to a goodbye nobody else was meant to read. Reminders that whatever Elvis became to the planet, he had once been simply a man trying to hold on to something real. Priscilla's connection to him was not a rumor, not a theory. It was a chapter of his life that shaped the man behind the myth. And in moments like this, when the tomb itself is disturbed, that chapter returns not as gossip, but as ache. A reminder that people carry grief differently when the person they lost belonged to everyone. Comment or write. R.I.P. Priscilla to honor them. Lisa Marie. Presley's name arrived like a pulse through the legacy, proof that the king wasn't only a legend, but a father whose story extended beyond his own breath. For years she was fiercely protective, not only of his image, but of her own private grief. And when the news of the tomb opening spread, the world waited for the family to speak, because no one stood closer to the real Elvis than the people who shared blood and memory, though she was no longer alive by the time this moment unfolded. Her estate released a brief statement that held both love and boundary. Elvis belonged to the world, but he was ours first. May this moment be met with respect. Those words didn't answer every question. They weren't meant to. They were a line drawn in tenderness, reminding the world that even the largest legends still had a home, still had people who loved him without needing an audience. Around that statement, other family voices carried conflict. Some felt the opening was a violation. Others quietly saw it as closure. And the silence from the family, what they didn't say, was just as heavy as what they did. Because sometimes grief doesn't want to perform. Sometimes grief simply survives. Comment or write. Rip Lisa Marie Presley to honor them. Asterisk, asterisk, once the tomb was opened and the remains confirmed, the story moved from legend into laboratory light. This was the moment that promised to end 50 years of argument with one cold, undeniable answer. Was it really Elvis Presley? To settle it, forensic experts were brought in, professionals trained to separate grief from proof, trained to look at what time leaves behind and tell the truth without trembling. Their work was delicate, almost sacred. The goal wasn't spectacle. It was certainty. First came the physical examination. Measurements, bone structure, the quiet language of anatomy compared against old records. The remains were consistent with what history had always recorded: a white male, around 6 feet tall, with skeletal details lining up with known medical documentation. Dental patterns matched charts that had been preserved. Even the trace of an old injury, one small fracture said to have happened when Elvis was young, still showed itself in the bone. Like time had carried it faithfully into the dark and refused to erase it. To those trained eyes, it wasn't just close. It was almost unmistakable. As one specialist reportedly put it, this was the kind of match you don't often get when decades have passed. So precise it felt like history had been waiting to be verified. Then came the part that people had begged for, feared, prayed for, the DNA dot at first. There was no thunderous announcement, no dramatic podium moment. The silence around the results felt tense, like the world was holding its breath again. But soon, sources close to the process claimed what many expected and many refused to accept. The genetic match was conclusive. The remains aligned with the Presley bloodline tethered to his mother's legacy, connected to his daughter's. It's Elvis, one investigator reportedly said. No question. The science lines up with the legend. And with that, the strongest foundation under the oldest rumor cracked. The theory that he had fled and lived in secret, walked away, and started over should have collapsed into dust. But belief is not always built on evidence. Sometimes belief is built on longing. Even with the science speaking plainly, there were voices that resisted. People claimed manipulation. They claimed the testing wasn't open enough, not independent enough, not clean enough. They called it staged. They insisted the world was being guided into acceptance like it always had been, yet the facts stood tall, unshaken. After decades of whispers, the official word was clear. Elvis never left the building. His body had been in Memphis all along, and so had the truth. And still, the story didn't end because the mind that wants mystery will always search for one more shadow, even after confirmation. One rumor returned like a ghost that refused to stay buried, the unsettling idea that Elvis's coffin had once been empty. Or worse, that the world had mourned a decoy, a wax figure, a substitute meant to carry the weight of farewell while the real man slipped away unseen. It sounded outrageous. It always had, and yet it endured for decades, passed along in hushed tones the way people pass down folktales. The way they hold on to strange possibilities when ordinary truth feels too small for someone so large. The roots of that rumor went back to the funeral in 1977, to the witnesses who claimed something felt wrong. They said his face looked too smooth, too still, like something crafted rather than lived in. Some described the sight as unreal, like grief itself had become theatrical. And then there was that infamous detail, the weight of the casket. People said it took 6 men, straining, struggling to lift it. Mortuary workers and observers whispered that the weight didn't make sense for one body alone. And when something doesn't make sense, imagination fills the gap like water rushing into a crack. From there, theories grew wilder. Some imagined a cooling system built into the casket designed to preserve the illusion. Others believed the body had been moved at the last moment, either out of fear of grave robbers or as part of a planned disappearance. It sounded like fiction. And yet, the question stayed alive because the man at the center of it wasn't ordinary. Elvis was myth-sized, and myths invite impossible questions. Now, after the tomb was opened, that rumor faced its final test, and what they found was definitive. The casket contained human remains, aligned with documented burial records. There was no evidence of wax, no trace of decoy materials, no signs the body had ever been removed and replaced. The story, at least in that part, finally had its answer, but even then, even with proof resting in the hands of science, some refused to surrender their doubt. One theorist insisted that just because a body was there now didn't mean it had always been there. That's the strange power of obsession. It can outlive evidence. It can keep moving long after the truth stands still, yet while one rumor faded, another discovery took its place, something quieter, smaller, far more haunting than any empty casket theory, because hidden beneath other belongings, sealed away like a private heartbeat, was something that felt almost impossible to touch with words. Letter, among everything uncovered inside the tomb, among the personal effects. The folded memories, the pieces of a life pressed into darkness, one item stood apart. It wasn't gold. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't something meant to dazzle. It was a sealed envelope, tucked away beneath old fabric and a photograph of Lisa Marie. Like someone had tried to bury a message beneath time itself. On the front, there were words that made the room feel colder, to be opened only when the world is ready. Inside was a handwritten note believed to be from Elvis, and what it contained didn't read like a publicity stunt or a legend builder. It read like a man reaching for air. The letter was raw in its emotion. It spoke of pressure, of exhaustion, of a kind of loneliness that fame can't fix, only magnify. It described the strange pain of being loved as an image instead of understood as a person, of being celebrated for the mask. While the man behind it faded, he wrote about feeling hollow while smiling, about moving through rooms full of people and still feeling alone, about being surrounded by worship and yet starving for something simple, something human. And then came the line that made the old myths shake awake again. Not a direct confession, not a clear plan, but a sentence that sounded like a door left slightly open. If I ever vanish, it's not because I'm gone. It's because I want to be real again, for a world already trained to look for secret meanings. That line hit like lightning. Was it a metaphor? Was it fear? Was it longing? Or was it something closer to a hidden plan? Handwriting analysts reportedly confirmed the writing matched known samples. The ink, paper, and seal were consistent with materials from the 1970s. In other words, the letter was considered authentic, and that authenticity made everything inside it heavier, not lighter, because an authentic letter doesn't just fuel a theory. It reveals a soul. Was it a warning? A confession? Or simply the final reach of a man drowning inside the legend he created? For fans, it felt like being punched in the chest. For skeptics, it was gasoline. For Elvis's legacy, it became another piece of the puzzle that might never fully come together. He may have died in 1977, but through that sealed message, his voice was speaking again in 2025 soft, tired and human. And with every discovery, one truth grew clearer. Elvis's life had become bigger than his death. That is why people never stopped asking questions. Because Elvis Presley was never only a singer. He became a symbol of rebellion, freedom, youth, movement, and a kind of electricity that didn't ask permission. For millions, losing him didn't feel like losing a celebrity. It felt like losing a piece of their own story, the soundtrack to who they were becoming. And that kind of grief doesn't disappear. It transforms. It becomes obsession. It becomes ritual. It becomes a pilgrimage to Graceland, year after year, like returning to a place where a part of the world once felt brighter. It's not hard to understand. Elvis's career wasn't simply successful, it was historic. He shifted culture. He changed the shape of performance. He pushed boundaries with his voice, his presence, his movement. He became a bridge across generations and a spark in the bloodstream of American entertainment. But beyond impact, he felt personal. Everyone had an Elvis song. Everyone had a memory tied to his sound. He wasn't just on radio stations, he lived inside living rooms, inside first dances, inside heartbreaks, inside highways at night. when someone that iconic dies young. When the ending comes fast and leaves questions in its wake, myths don't just appear, they grow. And what people really chased wasn't bones or letters. It was closure, or maybe something even deeper than closure. Permission to keep believing. Not because it's true, but because it comforts the part of us that can't accept a world where a flame like that simply goes out. Because Elvis was never just a man, that he became a story, and stories don't die, they evolve. Asterisk, asterisk with Colonel Tom. Parker's shadow still stretching across the story. Another rumor began to rise again, one that wasn't just about business or publicity or the machinery of fame. This one felt stranger, more intimate, almost supernatural in the way it reached backward into the earliest hours of Elvis Presley's life, because Elvis wasn't born alone. On January 8th, 1935, a twin brother arrived first, Jesse Garvin Presley stillborn, only minutes before Elvis took his first breath. A life that never opened its eyes, a name that still lived in the family's mouth like a prayer that never finished. And for Elvis, that absence became a presence. For him, the loss wasn't only a detail of biography, it was a shadow that followed him, a silence he grew up listening to. An invisible companion that shaped the way he looked at the world, the way he carried loneliness, the way he sometimes seemed to drift as if he were half here and half somewhere else. In the world of conspiracy and obsession, that tragedy took on a different shape. Some fringe theories claimed Jesse didn't truly die. Others suggested something even more unsettling, that the brothers were switched. Or that Elvis, desperate to escape his own mythology, later vanished and stepped into another identity tied to the twin he never got to know. Wild ideas. Most dismissed instantly, but their existence revealed something deeper than logic. People wanted a doorway. Out of finality, they wanted an alternate ending, and in that desire, Jesse Garvin Presley became part of the myth, not because he lived, but because Elvis's life always carried a feeling of being unfinished, as if he'd been born with a missing piece already carved out. Stories surfaced about Elvis visiting Jesse's grave as a child, about him leaving flowers, about him speaking into the stillness like someone speaking into a mirror that didn't reflect back. Some accounts described Elvis referring to a feeling that he was split in two, that something was always trailing behind him, unseen but present, whether those moments were literal or remembered through the haze of grief. They became fuel for writers, for theorists, for anyone who believed a twin bond could bend reality. When the tomb was opened, some of those believers hoped for something, anything that might point toward Jesse, a shared symbol, a hidden tribute, a message meant for a brother who never walked into the world beside him. And among the items discovered, one object drew attention, a locket marked with two initials, E and J. To most, it was what it looked like, a sentimental piece of love, carried like a private ache. A reminder that the missing twin was never truly missing from Elvis's mind, but to the ones who needed mystery, it became another thread in a tapestry that refuses to be folded away, because when people can't accept an ending, even the smallest object can become a sign. Jesse Garvin Presley remained what he had always been, a ghost made of possibility, stitched into the story of a man whose life became too large to close properly. Comment or write, R.I.P. Jesse Garvin Presley, to honor them. And as theories collided with evidence, as science tried to speak louder than longing, one final rumor kept standing up again and again. No matter how many times it was pushed down. What if Elvis's body wasn't at Graceland at all? Not because of a decoy, not because of a hoax, but because it had been moved quietly, secretly years ago, relocated for protection or for privacy, or to hide something the world wasn't supposed to see. It sounded like the kind of story that belongs to spy novels, whispered in parking lots and passed along between strangers who feel like they're holding a forbidden truth. But the seed of the rumor came from something real, something recorded in the public timeline, because Elvis wasn't originally laid to rest at Graceland. He was first buried at Forest Hill Cemetery in Memphis. Then, 2 months later, his remains were moved. Officially, the explanation was security. Fear of vandals, fear of grave robbers, fear of the kind of obsession that can turn grief into danger. And on the surface, it made sense. Elvis Presley's death wasn't a normal loss. It was a global wound. People were desperate. People were unstable. And there had already been threats and chaos surrounding the aftermath. Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, said the move was to keep his son safe in death, to bring him home, to place him somewhere the family could protect. It was a father's instinct, sharpened by tragedy, but rumors have a way of crawling through the smallest gaps. Some accounts claim the relocation was rushed, quiet, handled under the cover of night. Eyewitnesses swore the casket looked different. Others believed the transfer wasn't a second burial at all, but the first time the real body was placed where it belonged. Some insisted Forest Hill had been a symbolic move, something done for the public eye, while the true resting place was always meant to be something else. There were whispers about incomplete records, about documents not released, about things sealed away from public scrutiny. And when information is withheld, whether for privacy or protection, the imagination doesn't stay. Polite. It breaks in. It fills the silence with its own version of events, even after the tomb was opened, and the evidence showed the remains were there. Some believers refused to let the relocation rumor die. They said the body might have been moved at some point and returned later. They said the presence of remains now didn't erase the possibility of an earlier secret, because to them, the myth mattered more than the timeline. And still, there was something haunting in that thought, a world so unwilling to release Elvis that it kept reinventing ways to keep him in motion. Even in death, Vernon Presley's name sits at the center of that tension between protection and secrecy, between family grief and public hunger. In the aftermath of Elvis's death, Vernon wasn't simply a man making decisions. He was a father standing in the wreckage, trying to hold together what fame had scattered to the world. Elvis belonged to everyone. To Vernon, Elvis was still his son, and that difference matters. By this point, the tomb had been opened, the remains confirmed, the letter discovered. But behind the headlines, one name kept surfacing again and again, like a shadow moving along the edge of the spotlight. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, his protector, and to some, the quiet architect of a machine that never stopped turning. Parker wasn't a background figure. He wasn't simply a negotiator. He was a gatekeeper, a force, a hand that controlled the direction of the career, the deals, the appearances, the public narrative. He shaped Elvis's life in ways most audiences never saw, guiding what came in and what stayed out. And when questions swirl around Elvis's death and burial, Parker's name never stays far behind. He controlled the stage. He controlled the contracts. He controlled the access. Even Elvis's interviews, the shape of his public voice, often passed through Parker's hands. He negotiated massive deals, built an empire, and kept Elvis on a leash so tight some believed it began to cut. Some observers called him brilliant. Others called him dangerous. Some believed he made Elvis. Others believed he broke him. And when Elvis died, Parker remained involved in decisions that mattered: funeral details, what was said publicly, what was left unsaid. Some theorists have long believed Parker understood something important, that a legend could earn even when the man could not, that the myth, if protected, could outlive the truth. There are claims he leaned into ambiguity, that he didn't silence rumors too quickly because mystery keeps people looking, keeps them buying, keeps the name breathing. Whether intentional or not, his silence after the death became part of the mythology. In interviews, he often shifted away from the circumstances and toward the accomplishments, redirecting the spotlight back to the shine instead of the shadow, not deception, distraction, and in doing so, he helped create something even more powerful than Elvis the Man. Elvis the Myth. Comment or write Rip Colonel Tom Parker to honor them.